Today, we are going to look at the most disturbing deaths, from losing your life trying to hit a world record to travels that turned dreams into nightmares. Let's dive straight into... It was September 8, 2017. Off the coast of Dahab, Egypt, the Red Sea was calm under the morning sun, but just offshore sat the Blue Hole, a vertical sinkhole dropping hundreds of feet into darkness. Divers around the world knew it for its beauty, but also for its deadly record. More than 100 people had died there, most from pushing far beyond safe diving limits. Eric Dawson, 34, from the United Kingdom, stood on the rocky shore checking his gear. He had years of recreational diving experience in tropical vacation spots, but he wasn't a trained technical diver. His past dives had been in warm, shallow water, nothing like the extreme depths he planned to reach that day. Eric had spent months planning the dive, studying maps of the Blue Hole and reading accounts from others who had attempted extreme depths there. He wanted to test his limits and see how far he could push himself underwater. For him, this trip was about personal achievement and the challenge of completing one of the most difficult dives in the world. To save money, Eric skipped hiring a full safety team. Instead, he brought along Khalid, a local underwater photographer. Khalid had no training for deep technical dives, but he agreed to film from a safer depth while Eric went for his record attempt. The weather was perfect. The water was clear, with sunlight streaming down the reef walls. Eric entered the water and began descending along the vertical drop. His plan was to go beyond 300 feet before starting a slow, staged descent to avoid decompression sickness. By the time he passed 200 feet, the water temperature had dropped sharply, and the pressure on his body was extreme. Khaled stopped at 130 feet, watching Eric's figure fade into the blue below. At around 300 feet, Eric began feeling the effects of nitrogen narcosis, a mental fog caused by breathing compressed air at high pressure. It slowed his thinking and made reading his depth gauge harder. Instead of turning back immediately, Eric paused at about 350 feet to adjust his camera, losing precious ascent time. When he finally started going up, he moved too quickly. Panic appeared to set in as he overshot his planned decompression stops. Khalid noticed his erratic movement and swam down to meet him at 130 feet. By then, Eric's eyes were glassy and his breathing was shallow. They stopped for decompression, but halfway through, Eric went completely limp. Khalid tried to bring him to the surface, but without training in deep-water rescues, he rushed the ascent. The speed skipped several safety stops, making the situation even worse. On the surface, the boat crew pulled Eric aboard. They started CPR immediately and called for emergency help. Within minutes, Eric began to seize, a clear sign of severe decompression sickness, before falling unconscious. Paramedics met the boat at the pier and took over resuscitation efforts, but it was too late. Eric was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later confirmed the cause of death as a combination of nitrogen narcosis, rapid ascent, and decompression sickness. His camera footage cut off during the ascent, right before Khalid's attempt to pull him up. Local diving authorities used Eric's death as a warning to others. Deep technical dives require specialized training, the right breathing gases, and a qualified support team. Without them, even experienced recreational divers face overwhelming risks. It was March 3, 2018 in the port of Miami. The sun was setting behind the city skyline as a cruise ship prepared to depart, its decks buzzing with last-minute checks and quiet urgency. Below, in the steel and fluorescent corridors reserved for crew, one task lingered unfinished. It was a routine maintenance job, but one that carried the potential for disaster. The man assigned to it was Reynaldo Cruz, a 32-year-old Filipino maintenance technician from Cebu. Reynaldo had worked at sea for nearly a decade, building a reputation among his colleagues as careful, dependable, and uncomplaining. His motivation was practical. He supported his wife and 2 young children back home, sending money each month to cover tuition and household expenses. He rarely drank, avoided conflict, and preferred the quiet rhythm of mechanical work. While not fearless, he accepted risk as part of his trade, trusting his training and years of experience in confined, hazardous spaces. The ship itself was outfitted with multiple service elevators, each critical to moving supplies, equipment, and crew across decks without disrupting passengers. These machines, while routine, demanded constant upkeep. Misaligned doors, frayed cables, or jammed sensors could halt operations. Reynaldo knew the systems well. He carried basic tools and followed procedures, but the elevators had been acting up in the days prior, one in particular jamming and alarming sporadically. Temporary fixes kept it running, but a permanent inspection had been delayed with departure looming. On that evening, Reynaldo was sent to address the fault before the ship cleared port. A few other crew members lingered nearby with cleaning carts, waiting for the elevator to be functional. One co-worker later recalled muttering that it should have been locked out of service until a full repair, but with departure underway, the pressure was to get it working. Ronaldo opened the control panel and attempted a manual reset. He moved quickly, focused, perhaps aware that supervisors were expecting the problem to be resolved before passengers noticed any disruption. The witnesses remembered what happened next. A metallic snap rang out, sharp and unnatural, followed by the grinding surge of the elevator car rising. Ronaldo, positioned in the doorway to adjust the mechanism, was caught between the moving lift and the deck frame. His torso was compressed first, ribs audibly cracking as his tools clattered to the floor. He screamed once, a raw, tearing sound, before the rising steel forced the air from his lungs. Co-workers slammed the call buttons and jammed a crowbar against the doors, but the machinery groaned on. Flesh and bone began to give way under the crushing weight, blood forcing through his shirt in sudden bursts. By the time the lift halted, his chest and abdomen were flattened against the frame, spine visibly bent and ruptured. The ship's infirmary staff could do nothing when they arrived. Ronaldo was pronounced dead in the narrow passageway, his remains left grotesquely pinned until the elevator could be powered down and pried open. Several of his colleagues vomited at the sight. Others stood in silence, unable to move. Ronaldo's body was flown home to Cebu days later. His wife received compensation from the cruise line, though no payment could account for the brutal manner of his death. The U.S. Coast Guard ordered immediate inspection of every elevator on board before the vessel was cleared for its next voyage. It was October 12, 2017, and the streets of Mumbai pulsed with the energy of 20 million people preparing for one of India's most important religious festivals. The massive city, India's financial capital and Bollywood headquarters, had transformed into a sea of colorful decorations and temporary shrines as millions of devotees prepared to celebrate. The air hung thick with incense smoke and the sounds of traditional music, while narrow streets designed for much smaller populations struggled to accommodate the festival crowds. Emma Rodriguez adjusted her colorful dupatta as she followed her local friends through the crowded marketplace, her excitement building as she prepared to experience an authentic Indian festival celebration. At 21, the university exchange student had been studying Indian culture and language in Mumbai for 3 months, eager to immerse herself in experiences that went far beyond typical tourist activities. Her semester abroad program had strict guidelines about safety and staying in groups, but Emma's adventurous spirit often led her to bend the rules in pursuit of genuine cultural experiences. The festival celebration represented everything Emma had hoped to experience during her time in India: authentic traditions, spiritual significance, and the kind of cultural immersion that couldn't be found in textbooks. Her local friends had invited her to join their family's celebration in a densely populated neighborhood where few foreigners ever ventured. Against program guidelines, Emma frequently explored crowded local markets and neighborhoods alone, believing that her enthusiasm and respect for local culture would protect her from harm. The warning signs about crowd safety were present, but ignored in the excitement of festival preparation. Mumbai's infrastructure was already strained by its massive population, and the addition of millions of festival participants created dangerous overcrowding in areas with limited exits. Emma's program coordinators had warned students about avoiding large crowds, but the cultural significance of the festival made their warnings seem overly cautious. As the festival celebration reached its peak, Emma found herself surrounded by thousands of devotees in a narrow street designed to accommodate perhaps a few hundred people. The crowd density made movement difficult, with bodies pressed together so tightly that individual control became impossible. When rumors of a fire began spreading through the crowd, panic erupted with devastating consequences. The stampede began when someone shouted "Fire!" in the local language, sending waves of terror through the tightly packed crowd. Emma became separated from her local friends in the initial surge of panicking people, her small frame making it impossible to resist the crushing force of thousands trying to escape through inadequate exits. She was caught in the deadly crush of people trying to flee, unable to move or breathe as the human tide carried her toward the ground. Emma was trampled underfoot by the panicking crowd, suffering fatal injuries as hundreds of people fled over her fallen body. Local authorities were overwhelmed and unable to control the chaos or provide adequate emergency response. Emma's body was found hours later, among dozens of other victims of the stampede tragedy, her dreams of cultural understanding ending in a moment of mass hysteria. The university exchange program faced intense scrutiny for inadequate safety protocols, while Emma's family struggled to navigate the complex Indian legal system to bring her remains home. It was March 12, 2015, in the North Atlantic, midway through a storm-tossed crossing from New York to Southampton. The ship pressed forward through swells that shook its steel frame, each roll sending plates rattling in the dining halls and glasses clinking along the bars. Among the thousands on board, one woman made her way back to her cabin alone, unaware she was walking into the final moments of her life. Margaret Ellis, 74, was a retired nurse from Manchester. She had built her life around steady care for others, decades of ward work, and then later, volunteering at a hospice. Widowed, she traveled when she could, favoring cruises for their steady routines and opportunities to see places she had only read about. She was sociable but quiet, sharing dinners with a table of fellow British retirees. Her health was fair, her stride slightly cautious from a hip replacement, but she still managed long daily walks on the promenade deck, even in rough weather. For Margaret, risk had always been practical, never romantic. She was the sort of traveler who avoided excursions promising thrills, preferring lectures, reading lounges, and evenings of conversation. But the North Atlantic in March is unforgiving, and even the safest-seeming spaces carried dangers. Cruise ships rely on narrow stairwells that rise in stacked flights. In calm seas, they are routine passages. In heavy weather, they can become hazardous traps, with each lurch magnifying the force of a single misstep. That evening, the ship rocked harder than most passengers expected. Winds funneled across the decks, and waves struck broadside, rolling the vessel sharply from port to starboard. Crew urged caution, suggesting guests remain in cabins or use lifts rather than stairs. But elevators had grown crowded, and Margaret, not wanting to wait, declined her companion's offers to escort her. She left the dining hall early, telling them she wanted to lie down before the seas grew worse. Security footage later showed her entering the midship stairwell. She steadied herself on the first landing, pausing with her weight forward. The vessel lurched again just as she reached across to adjust the strap. Her grip broke, her body swung sideways, and her feet lost the steps beneath them. Witnesses on the lower deck saw her pitch forward, her temple glancing hard against the rail before her body folded awkwardly. She bounced off the edge of one stair, then another, striking steel with a series of dull thuds. She tumbled through the remaining flights, her arm twisting unnaturally beneath her before her head took the final impact. The stairwell froze, passengers staring at the body crumpled against the risers, her chest convulsing once before falling still. It took them a few seconds of silence and gasps before anyone called out for help. Crew medics arrived within minutes. They began compressions, fitting an oxygen mask, but the effort was mechanical. After prolonged attempts, the ship's doctor pronounced her dead. Her body was kept in the ship's morgue until arrival in Southampton, then flown to Manchester. Her children arranged a small funeral with close family and neighbors. The cruise line offered condolences and quietly introduced stricter protocols, staff reminders for elderly passengers, improved lighting, and more visible caution signage. It was December 5th, 2013, and the Caribbean Sea stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars as the cruise ship cut through calm waters toward its next port of call. The massive vessel, carrying over 3,000 passengers and crew, had become a floating city of entertainment and indulgence, where safety protocols often took a back seat to passenger satisfaction. The ship's multiple bars and nightclubs stayed open until the early morning hours, serving alcohol to passengers who had little awareness of the dangers lurking just beyond the deck railings. Linda Patterson laughed with her sister as they celebrated her recent divorce and newfound independence during their week-long Caribbean cruise. At 45, the nurse had worked double shifts for months to afford the vacation that represented her fresh start after a difficult marriage. The ship's all-inclusive alcohol policy had led to heavy drinking throughout the evening, with Linda visiting multiple bars and seeming intoxicated but happy as the night progressed. Security footage showed Linda leaving the ship's main nightclub around 2 a.m., appearing unsteady, but walking independently toward what should have been her cabin. Her sister had gone to bed earlier, assuming Linda would return safely to their shared room. The ship's corridors were dimly lit and largely deserted at that hour, with minimal security presence to monitor passenger movements or provide assistance to those who might be in distress. The cruise ship's design prioritized passenger access to scenic views over safety, with numerous unsecured deck areas that passengers could access at any hour. Warning signs about the dangers of going overboard were minimal, and often obscured by decorative elements designed to maintain the ship's luxurious atmosphere. Linda's intoxicated state made her vulnerable to the kind of tragic accident that cruise lines preferred to keep quiet. Somehow, Linda made her way to an unsecured area of the ship's deck in the early morning hours, possibly seeking fresh air or a quiet place to clear her head. Whether due to intoxication, disorientation, or potentially foul play that was never fully investigated, she fell overboard into the dark ocean waters 200 miles from the nearest land. The ship's automated systems failed to detect her fall, and she wasn't discovered missing until the next morning when her sister found their cabin empty. Linda struggled in the cold water for hours as the massive cruise ship continued on its course, unaware that a passenger was fighting for her life in its wake. The ocean temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit would normally be survivable, but Linda's intoxicated state and the trauma of the fall made it impossible for her to stay afloat. She succumbed to hypothermia and drowning as the ship disappeared over the horizon, leaving her alone in the vast expanse of ocean. Her body was never recovered from the Caribbean Sea, leaving her family without closure and with countless unanswered questions about how she'd ended up overboard. The cruise line initially downplayed the incident and suggested Linda had intentionally jumped, a claim that devastated her family and deflected responsibility from the ship's inadequate safety measures. Investigation revealed multiple security failures and inadequate safety protocols for monitoring passengers, particularly during late-night hours when alcohol consumption was at its peak. Linda's family filed lawsuits alleging negligence and demanding better safety measures, while the incident sparked congressional hearings about cruise ship safety and the need for better passenger protection. New regulations were eventually implemented requiring improved deck security, passenger monitoring systems, and mandatory safety briefings about the dangers of going overboard. Linda's death became a catalyst for industry-wide changes that would protect future passengers from similar tragedies. It was June 17, 2016, in Miami, Florida. The Carnival Victory was docked, its decks being cleaned and restocked before passengers boarded the next voyage. Deep below the bustling upper decks, a routine maintenance task was being carried out, one that would end with a tragedy few outside the crew would ever hear about. Carlos Mendez, 35, was a maintenance technician from Honduras. He had worked on cruise ships for 6 years, known among colleagues as dependable and careful, often taking the shifts others avoided. He lived frugally while aboard, sending most of his pay home to his wife and 2 children. Though the job was dangerous at times, he accepted the risks because it provided more stability than anything he could find back home. Friends described him as disciplined and modest, someone who rarely complained even when the work was exhausting. On a cruise liner, elevators are critical, not just for passengers, but for the crew moving supplies through hidden service corridors. Carlos specialized in mechanical systems, and over time he became the one others turned to when problems arose. Cruise ship elevators are different from land-based ones. Compact shafts, narrow access points, and constant strain from heavy daily use. That afternoon, a crew-only elevator had been reported faulty, and Carlos was assigned alongside 2 co-workers to repair it. The task seemed routine, but there were warning signs. The brake system on the elevator had been reported before, and though partial fixes were made, the replacement parts had not yet arrived. Official procedure required full lockout-tagout before anyone entered the shaft, but schedules were tight. The men decided to proceed, planning only a quick alignment check while the ship was docked. Carlos stepped into the shaft while his colleagues monitored above. He had done this dozens of times before. For a few minutes, everything was steady. Carlos crouched, inspecting the guide rails. Then, with no warning, the elevator car above shuddered and slipped. His co-workers shouted, but the gap was too narrow for him to escape. In seconds, the car dropped downward. Carlos turned as if to push away, but it was too late. The heavy steel slammed him against the shaft wall with crushing force. Witnesses later described the scene in grim detail, fell. His lower body remained visible while his torso was pinned, blood pooling on the steel floor. His co-workers hit the emergency stop, but the damage was already fatal. Medical staff, called by the other workers, arrived within minutes, yet there was nothing they could do. His body was carefully removed and prepared for repatriation. Carnival covered funeral expenses, arranging transport back to Honduras. His family held a closed casket service, attended by neighbors and relatives who remembered him as a man who sacrificed for his family. The Coast Guard investigated, citing mechanical failure compounded by lapses in safety procedure. The report recommended stricter adherence to lockout-tagout rules. It was August 29, 2018, aboard the Norwegian Escape as it crossed the Atlantic en route to Bermuda. The sun bore down on the ship's decks, the pools filled with families taking advantage of the calm sea. For one boy, what began as a routine swim would become a preventable tragedy. Lucas Rivera, 15, from Newark, New Jersey, was a strong swimmer. He had joined his high school swim team the year before and often pushed himself to stay underwater longer than his peers. His parents described him as competitive, curious, and restless, always eager to prove he could do what others found difficult. On the cruise, he gravitated toward the crowded main pool, insisting that even with younger children splashing around, he could still carve out space to dive and test his limits. His mother warned him to use the smaller, quieter pool toward the stern, but Lucas brushed it off. He wanted the challenge of the larger pool, where the depth and volume felt closer to the competitive settings he preferred. Cruise pools are designed with circulation systems that rely on suction drains to keep water filtered and clear. Though safety standards had been updated years earlier to reduce entrapment hazards, the escape system had not yet been refitted with newer protective covers, a detail unknown to most passengers. Unlike land-based public pools, cruise vessels often operate under a patchwork of international regulations, meaning older equipment can remain in service if not flagged during inspections. That afternoon, Lucas dove near the corner of the main pool, where one of the primary drains operated. His younger sister remembered watching him swim straight down, holding his breath, determined to stay under longer than before. Passengers nearby said they saw him pause at the bottom, then suddenly thrash. At first, it seemed like a playful movement, but within seconds, his arms shot out in desperate motions as his body pressed against the pool floor. Children screamed, alerting nearby adults. A man jumped in, trying to pull Lucas up, but the boy's torso was pinned flat by suction. His sister cried for help as more crew members rushed over. Witnesses later said the water around him quivered with turbulence from the intake, as if holding him down with invisible hands. His legs kicked violently, then slowed. Small clouds of blood appeared near his nose and mouth. Shouts filled the pool deck as crew scrambled to shut off the pump system. But unlike a home pool with a simple switch, the ship's system required crew to reach a locked maintenance panel below deck. The delay stretched into minutes. When the suction finally released, Lucas was hauled to the surface limp, his skin bluish. Crew members and a passenger nurse began CPR immediately on deck. For nearly 30 minutes, passengers, many in swimsuits dripping water, stood in silence as compressions and breaths were given. Children clutched parents as the scene stretched on. Despite the effort, Lucas never regained consciousness. Within a week, his funeral was held in Newark, drawing classmates, teachers, and neighbors who had watched him grow up. The Coast Guard's report cited improperly maintained suction fittings and delayed emergency response procedures as contributing factors. Norwegian quickly retrofitted its pools, but for his family, the changes came far too late. It was March 15, 2017, in Denver, Colorado. Allison Greer, a 28-year-old marketing coordinator for a tech startup, was rushing through Westfield Shopping Center on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday evening. Known for her meticulous attention to detail at work, Allison had one quirk that friends often teased her about. She never properly tied her bright red Nike running shoes, leaving the laces dangerously long and loose. That evening, she was meeting her younger sister at the mall's jewelry store to help pick out an engagement ring. The mall was unusually crowded due to flash sales at multiple stores, creating heavy foot traffic throughout the building. Allison carried a large shopping bag from her earlier purchases, while constantly checking her phone for her sister's location updates. At 6:47 p.m., security cameras captured her approaching the up escalator near the food court. She was distracted, scrolling through text messages, completely unaware that her left shoelace was trailing behind her foot as she stepped onto the moving stairs. The escalator was an older 2003 model that had been recently serviced. but maintenance records showed 3 previous incidents where clothing had become caught in its worn comb plate mechanism. As Allison rode halfway up the escalator, disaster struck. Her loose shoelace threaded through the metal grating and became entangled in the comb plate mechanism at the top landing. The moving step continued upward with relentless force, yanking her left foot forward violently. She lost her balance immediately, her body twisting as she fell backward against the escalator's unforgiving metal side panel. The impact was devastating. Allison's temple struck the sharp edge of the escalator's housing with tremendous force, causing immediate disorientation and a severe concussion. The metallic clang echoed through the mall as panicked shoppers witnessed the horrifying accident unfold before their eyes. Blood began flowing from her ear within seconds, a telltale sign of serious traumatic brain injury. Though she remained conscious initially, Allison showed classic symptoms of severe head trauma: confusion, slurred speech, and unequal pupil dilation. Shoppers frantically searched for the emergency stop button, precious seconds ticking by before someone finally located and activated it. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, finding Allison conscious but severely disoriented on the escalator steps. Paramedics immediately recognized the gravity of her condition, noting the blood from her ear and her altered mental status. She was rushed to Denver General Hospital, where CT scans revealed the worst possible outcome: massive brain hemorrhaging from the impact. Despite emergency surgery to relieve the dangerous intracranial pressure building in her skull, Allison's condition continued to deteriorate. The trauma had caused irreversible damage to her brain tissue, and the bleeding could not be controlled. At 11:45 p.m., just over 5 hours after what began as a simple shopping trip, Allison Greer was pronounced dead from complications of traumatic brain injury. The mall implemented new safety protocols immediately following the tragedy, and the aging escalator was replaced within 2 months. But for Allison's family and friends, no safety measure could undo the devastating loss. A brilliant marketing professional with her whole life ahead of her had been taken by something as simple as an untied shoelace and a moment of distraction. Her death serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly everyday activities can turn deadly, and how the smallest oversights can have the most catastrophic consequences in our modern world. The security footage of her final moments became evidence in subsequent safety investigations, forever capturing the split second when a routine evening turned into an unimaginable tragedy. It was November 19th, 2018, aboard the MSC Divina as it crossed the Caribbean Sea between St. Thomas and Puerto Rico. The evening air outside was warm and calm, but inside the ship's main theater, where over 1,000 passengers gathered for the nightly production show, a quiet chain of decisions was unfolding that would soon end in disaster. Mark Delaney, 38, was an electrician from Glasgow, Scotland. He had worked in residential wiring since his early 20s, building a reputation for being dependable, meticulous, and deeply curious about how things functioned. Outside of work, he held a strong fascination with stage productions, especially the technical elements, the lighting rigs, hydraulic lifts, and sound systems. This cruise, booked as an anniversary trip with his wife, combined both his need for rest and his interest in peeking behind the curtain of large-scale productions. He was known to chat with crew whenever possible, eager to learn how such systems compared to the ones he worked with at home. Mark's relationship to risk was subtle. In his electrical work, he followed rules strictly, but in leisure he often let curiosity overrule caution. On board, he had wandered backstage during intermissions and after shows, slipping briefly into restricted areas under the excuse of just looking. His wife often pulled him back, reminding him it wasn't his place, but Mark had a casual stubbornness when something piqued his interest. The theater's retractable stage fascinated him, massive hydraulic sections that could rise and sink seamlessly during performances. For Mark, it was not only a novelty but also a technical marvel he wanted to understand up close. That night's production had just ended. The lights dimmed, passengers were leaving, and the stage crew began the process of resetting equipment. Mark and his wife lingered near the side seating area, where a rope line marked the edge of the technical zone. One crew member later recalled him leaning over the rope, his eyes fixed on the machinery as the lift lift began to lower. His wife urged him to step back, pointing out the equipment was already in motion. But Mark had been drinking, and instead of moving away, he shifted closer, steadying himself with one hand on the rope barrier while peering into the narrowing gap. The danger was greater than he realized. The hydraulics were designed for smooth but powerful movement, with no tolerance for obstruction. The lift platform was retracting into its housing, creating a closing gap less than a foot wide. Mark lost his balance, whether from leaning too far, misjudging the rail, or the effects of alcohol. No one could say for certain. Witnesses in the first rows saw him stumble forward, chest first, into the opening. The moment of impact was immediate and brutal. As the lift continued downward, his torso was caught between steel and stage frame. A series of cracking sounds carried through the theater as ribs and vertebrae gave way under thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure. His wife's scream cut through the stunned silence as blood appeared beneath the platform. Several passengers shouted for the machinery to stop, while stagehands scrambled to hit the emergency override. But even once halted, the damage was irreparable. Mark was motionless, pinned in place, his injuries catastrophic. Crew members ordered the theater cleared as medics rushed in, struggling to free him from the mechanism. Witnesses reported the crew working frantically, but the machinery, even reversed, moved too slowly to undo the crushing damage already inflicted. Within 40 minutes, ship medics confirmed he had died at the scene. His body was later removed discreetly under a sheet. Mark's widow returned to Glasgow within 2 weeks, accompanied by company staff. The funeral was small, but heavy with shock. Friends and co-workers struggling to reconcile the man they knew as careful with electricity, yet undone by a moment of preventable risk. Maritime investigators later cited inadequate safety barriers as a contributing factor, ordering all MSC vessels to increase perimeter protections around stage machinery. It was June 22nd, 2016 in Phoenix, Arizona. Cassandra Holt, a 26-year-old graphic designer for an advertising agency, was working late on the 12th floor of the Meridian office complex on what would become her final evening. Known for staying late to perfect her projects, Cassandra had recently started taking medication for anxiety that occasionally caused dizziness, especially when standing quickly. That Thursday evening, she was working alone on a campaign deadline while the building sat nearly empty, except for cleaning crews. Cassandra had been taking her prescribed anxiety medication, which sometimes made her feel lightheaded after sitting for extended periods. She had also purchased new high-heeled shoes earlier that day for an important client presentation scheduled for Friday morning. At 9:15 p.m., feeling restless after hours of computer work, Cassandra decided to take the stairs down to the parking garage to get some fresh air and stretch her legs. The Meridian complex featured a central stairwell with polished marble steps that looked elegant, but became treacherously slippery when wet. The building's cleaning crew had just finished mopping the stairwell floors, but hadn't yet placed wet floor warning signs. The stairwell lighting was dimmed to 50% capacity during evening hours as an energy-saving measure, creating shadows that made it difficult to see the wet surfaces clearly. Security cameras captured Cassandra entering the stairwell, moving quickly while checking messages on her phone, completely unaware of the danger beneath her feet. On the 8th floor landing, disaster struck without warning. Cassandra's new high heels slipped on the wet marble surface as she stepped down, causing her to lose her balance instantly. Her anxiety medication had made her slightly lightheaded, affecting her coordination at the worst possible moment. She fell backward violently, her head striking the concrete wall behind her with tremendous force. The impact caused an immediate severe concussion and disorientation as her body began tumbling down the unforgiving marble steps. Her body rolled down 15 steps to the 7th floor landing, with her head striking multiple step edges during the horrifying descent. Each impact caused additional trauma to her skull and brain, creating multiple contusions and internal bleeding. The marble steps showed no mercy as her body bounced against them repeatedly. Most critically, her neck twisted unnaturally during the fall, causing cervical spine fractures at the C2 and C3 vertebrae. The combination of severe head trauma and spinal injury caused immediate paralysis and loss of consciousness. Blood began pooling around her head from multiple scalp lacerations and dangerous internal brain bleeding. Her breathing became irregular and shallow due to the spinal cord damage affecting her respiratory system. Cassandra remained unconscious and motionless on the 7th floor landing, with no one nearby to hear her fall or call for help. The building's emptiness during evening hours meant that precious time passed before anyone would discover her. A cleaning crew member finally found her at 10:45 p.m. during routine floor checks. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but found her with no pulse and obvious signs of severe head and spinal trauma. The marble steps around her were stained with blood, telling the story of her tragic fall. She was pronounced dead at the scene from a traumatic brain injury and cervical spine fracture. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head with spinal cord transection, injuries that would have been instantly fatal. The building immediately implemented new safety protocols, including better lighting, non-slip surfaces, and mandatory wet floor signage. But for Cassandra's family and colleagues, no safety measure could bring back the talented designer whose promising career was cut short by a simple slip on wet stairs. It was October 4th, 2013, in the western Caucasus Mountains of Abkhazia, Georgia. The entrance to Krubera Cave opened wide in the limestone hillside. Dark and cold, moss covered the rocks, and water dripped steadily from above. Inside lay the deepest known cave in the world, dropping more than 7,200 feet through steep vertical shafts, narrow tunnels, and water-filled passages where the temperature stayed close to freezing all year. Jacob Ilyev adjusted his caving equipment as he prepared for the descent that would either establish his legacy or claim his life. At 41, the Bulgarian caver had spent more than 2 decades exploring subterranean systems across Europe, earning recognition in the community for his technical skill and calm under pressure. His weathered helmet and scarred gear reflected countless hours spent navigating the world's most challenging underground environments. The world record attempt represented Jacob's goal to achieve the deepest dry descent without diving equipment through Krubera's flooded sections, a feat that demanded precision, endurance, and absolute discipline. Unlike cavers who specialized in mixed dry and scuba exploration, Marco insisted on maintaining a dry-only approach that would push the boundaries of what was considered possible in deep cave systems. The expedition began with support from a small, experienced team that assisted with initial rigging, gear hauling, and documentation of the attempt. In the early stages, they helped Jacob navigate long vertical drops using fixed ropes, while hauling packs through squeezes that barely allowed room for helmets and equipment. The deeper they descended, the more unstable the cave became as wet rock, constant water drip, and loose stone made footing increasingly hazardous. By nearly 5,000 feet in depth, the cave had narrowed into a vertical shaft with slick, uneven surfaces, where most cavers either turned back or switched to scuba gear to continue into flooded passages. Jacob's determination to maintain his dry-only approach led him to insist on continuing alone into the unstable section, despite his team's objections about exponentially increased risks of solo travel at such depths. The shaft walls glistened with moisture as the sound of dripping water echoed endlessly in the absolute darkness. Jacob descended carefully, his hands gripping the rope while his boots sought small ledges for balance in the confined space. For several minutes, progress remained steady as he methodically worked his way deeper into the Earth's interior. A single misstep changed everything. When Jacob's right foot slipped on a patch of algae-slick rock in the narrow shaft, his body shifted sideways, throwing his center of gravity off the rope line as he tried desperately to recover. The confined walls and awkward rope position left no room for correction as his boot lost its hold entirely. The fall was short but violent as Jacob's body slammed into the shaft wall before tumbling onto a ledge nearly 30 feet below. The impact knocked him unconscious instantly, leaving him alone in the depths, with no one within immediate reach to render aid. His years of experience and technical skill proved meaningless against the unforgiving physics of falling rock and human fragility. His team knew something was wrong when he stopped moving, so they carefully made their way down. The narrow shaft and loose rocks slowed them, and when they reached him, he wasn't breathing. Getting him out of that depth would take hours of dangerous climbing through tight, unstable passages. Over the next 2 days, rescuers from multiple local caving clubs coordinated the extraction using specialized haul systems while working in shifts to navigate the exhausting climb toward daylight. The cold and damp conditions sapped energy from everyone involved as they methodically transported Jacob's body through the same passages that had challenged him in life. The official conclusion confirmed that a slip on wet rock in the narrow shaft had caused a fatal fall, where survival chances were virtually non-existent at such depths. It was November 14th, 2015 in Seattle, Washington. Megan Duarte, a 29-year-old marine biologist working at the Seattle Aquarium, was heading to work on what should have been a routine Saturday morning. Passionate about her research on Pacific Northwest sea life, Megan always parked in the same spot on the 4th level of Harbor View parking garage, space 4B-27, a habit she had maintained for 3 years. That rainy morning, she was responding to an emergency call about 6 sea otters at the aquarium. Megan had been fighting a cold and was taking antihistamines that made her drowsy and less alert than usual. The medication, combined with her dedication to her work, meant she often ignored her own discomfort to help the animals she cared for so deeply. The Harbor View parking garage's ventilation system had been malfunctioning for weeks, with several exhaust fans out of order. The concrete structure was notorious for trapping vehicle fumes, especially during Seattle's frequent rainy weather when windows stayed closed. Making matters worse, the garage's carbon monoxide detection system had been giving false alarms and was temporarily disabled for repairs. Megan arrived early at 7:45 a.m. when the garage was nearly empty, creating poor air circulation conditions. Her car had been having exhaust issues that she had been putting off repairing due to her busy work schedule and limited budget. She sat in her running car, organizing research notes for the emergency sea otter case, keeping her windows closed against the persistent rain. The garage's concrete walls and low ceiling created a perfect trap for exhaust fumes from the few running vehicles. Unknown to Megan, her car's faulty exhaust system was leaking carbon monoxide directly into the vehicle's cabin through a corroded seal near the muffler. As she organized her papers with the engine running, the colorless and odorless carbon monoxide began accumulating in dangerous concentrations. The antihistamines she had taken masked the early warning symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, including the mild headache and nausea that might have alerted her to the danger. Within 5 minutes, the deadly gas reached critical levels in her bloodstream, displacing oxygen and affecting her brain function. She began feeling increasingly drowsy and confused, symptoms she attributed to her cold medication in the early morning hour. Her coordination became impaired as carbon monoxide prevented her blood from carrying adequate oxygen to her vital organs. Megan attempted to start driving but felt too dizzy and disoriented. Deciding to rest for a few more minutes, she leaned back in her seat, unaware that she was sealing her fate. The carbon monoxide continued building in her system at an alarming rate, causing her to lose consciousness while still behind the wheel. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, as the poisonous gas systematically shut down her body's ability to transport oxygen. After 15 minutes of exposure to the concentrated fumes, she slipped into a coma from severe carbon monoxide poisoning, her body unable to fight the invisible killer. Another garage user discovered her unconscious in her running car at 8:30 a.m. and immediately called emergency services. Paramedics detected dangerous levels of carbon monoxide in the garage air and quickly evacuated the area while attempting to revive her. She was rushed to Harbor View Medical Center, where doctors placed her in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, the most aggressive treatment available for carbon monoxide poisoning. Despite their best efforts and cutting-edge medical intervention, the damage was too extensive. At 2:15 p.m., Megan Duarte was pronounced dead from carbon monoxide poisoning and resulting irreversible brain damage. The garage was immediately closed for emergency ventilation repairs and installation of new carbon monoxide detection systems. Megan's death served as a tragic reminder of how silent killers can lurk in everyday places, taking the lives of those dedicated to saving others. It was October 3rd, 2013, and the morning air hung cool and clear over Switzerland's Lauterbrunnen Valley as sheer limestone walls threw long shadows across the green valley floor. Near the landing field, a small crowd gathered around orange windsocks and cameras mounted on tripods, their attention focused on the towering cliffs where a wingsuit pilot prepared for a record attempt that would push the boundaries of proximity flying. Jared van der Merwe adjusted his wingsuit as he surveyed the route that had consumed his thoughts for months. At 35, the skilled wingsuit flyer had logged hundreds of base exits and long glide flights across Europe, earning respect in the proximity flying community for his clean lines and tight, controlled turns. His weathered equipment and confident demeanor reflected years of pushing limits in some of the world's most challenging flying environments. The record attempt represented Jared's goal to achieve the longest horizontal glide across the valley while hugging the cliff line for dramatic effect before crossing to the opposite wall and angling toward the landing field. He'd spent months refining a route that utilized known updrafts along the limestone formations, studying wind patterns and calculating glide ratios with obsessive precision. Conditions appeared favorable, as light winds at launch combined with stable air in the valley and cloud base well above the exit point. Jared wore a helmet and chest cameras set to record the attempt, while the landing crew maintained radio contact and GPS beacon links to helicopter services. Spectators stood behind safety tape, watching the cliffs where months of preparation would be tested in minutes of flight. At the exit ledge, Jared completed his final checklist: zipper seals, wings locked, pilot chute stowed, and altimeter set. He stepped to the edge, waited for steady wind readings, then pushed out into the void as his suit filled and leveled quickly, while building speed toward the limestone wall. Within seconds, Jared was carving along the cliff face no more than a few yards from the rock, his suit's glide carrying him at over 120 miles per hour. The flight line appeared smooth as he made small corrections at the shoulders while maintaining steady leg position and keeping his eyes focused on the next contour ahead. Approaching a limestone buttress, Jared's plan called for a shallow left turn to clear a slight overhang before transitioning across the valley. He initiated the turn a fraction later than ideal, causing the angle to tighten while his clearance narrowed dangerously. Helmet footage later revealed a tiny wobble in bank and pitch, nothing dramatic, but sufficient to alter his trajectory. Jared's left wing brushed the limestone at high speed in a contact that proved decisive. The strike at that velocity collapsed lift instantly while yawing him directly into the wall with no time to recover or deploy his reserve parachute. Dust puffed from the impact point and settled down the cliff face as witnesses below immediately called emergency services. The Valley helicopter reached the scene within 14 minutes, inserting a rope team on a ledge near the impact site. Rescuers confirmed that massive trauma had killed Jared instantly upon contact with the unforgiving limestone wall that had claimed another proximity flyer. It was April 17th, 2018 in Portland, Oregon. Catherine Voss, a 33-year-old real estate agent known for keeping her car immaculate for client meetings, was following her usual Tuesday morning routine. She washed her car twice weekly at Quick Clean Auto Wash, considering it her good luck ritual before her weekly team meeting. That morning, Catherine was running late for an important listing presentation and decided to quickly clean her car. She had recently injured her shoulder in a tennis match, leaving her with limited mobility in her left arm and making simple tasks more challenging. Quick Clean Auto Wash featured an older conveyor system with exposed mechanical components and minimal safety guards. The facility had been experiencing mechanical issues with the conveyor system jerking unexpectedly, but management had delayed repairs to avoid closing during busy periods. Catherine's car had a persistent problem. The driver's side door had a faulty latch that occasionally popped open. Like many busy professionals, she had postponed the repair, not realizing how dangerous this minor issue would become. She entered the wash bay at 8:15 a.m., following instructions to put her car in neutral and remain inside throughout the cycle. The attendant was handling another customer's complaint, leaving the system temporarily unmonitored. The conveyor engaged smoothly, pulling her car forward as soap and water began spraying. However, as her vehicle moved through the cycle, the faulty door latch gave way under vibration, causing the driver's side door to swing open unexpectedly. Catherine instinctively reached out with her injured arm to grab the door handle, not wanting soap to flood her interior. As she leaned out, Her sleeve became entangled in the conveyor system's exposed drive mechanism. The powerful motor continued operating, drawing her clothing and arm into the mechanical assembly with tremendous force. Her shoulder dislocated immediately as the mechanism pulled relentlessly, causing excruciating pain that echoed through the wash bay. The rotating gears crushed her forearm against the metal housing, fracturing both radius and ulnar bones with audible snapping. Most critically, the machinery severed major blood vessels, including radial and ulnar arteries, causing massive bleeding that pooled on concrete. Catherine's screams went unheard due to machinery noise and water spray, but customers eventually noticed the emergency. Blood loss from severed arteries caused rapid shock and unconsciousness as her body entered hypovolemic crisis. The emergency stop was activated after 90 seconds, but severe arterial damage had occurred. Customers and staff worked frantically using the manual release system to free her from the machinery. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, finding her unconscious from severe blood loss. Paramedics applied tourniquets and pressure bandages while establishing IV access, but she had lost critical amounts of blood from the arterial injuries. She was airlifted to Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, where trauma surgeons attempted emergency surgery to repair the damaged vessels. Despite multiple blood transfusions and aggressive resuscitation efforts, the blood loss was too severe to overcome. At 11:30 a.m., Catherine Voss was pronounced dead from exsanguination and hypovolemic shock caused by traumatic arterial injuries. The car wash was immediately shut down, pending a comprehensive safety investigation and a complete equipment overhaul, highlighting the hidden dangers of aging industrial equipment in everyday commercial facilities. Her tragic death led to new industry safety standards, requiring emergency stops within arm's reach and protective barriers around all moving machinery in automated car wash facilities nationwide. It was February 28, 2018, and the bustling border city of Tijuana, Mexico, hummed with the activity of medical tourists seeking affordable healthcare just miles from the United States. The city had built a thriving industry around Americans seeking dental work, plastic surgery, and other procedures at a fraction of U.S. costs. Converted houses and strip mall clinics advertised dramatic savings, though many operated with minimal oversight and questionable credentials that prioritized profits over patient safety. Robert Johnson studied the address on his phone as he searched for the dental clinic that had promised to save him thousands of dollars on extensive dental work. At 52, the construction foreman had been putting off necessary dental surgery for years due to the prohibitive costs in the United States. The clinic he'd chosen based on online reviews and low prices operated out of a converted house with minimal medical equipment and sanitation standards that would never pass U.S. inspection. Robert's family had urged him to have the procedure done locally by a licensed dentist, but his determination to save money had overridden their concerns about safety and quality. The $3,000 he'd budgeted for the Mexican procedure would have cost over $10,000 in the United States, making the financial incentive impossible to ignore. He'd arrived alone in Tijuana, planning to stay 3 days before returning home with his new dental work completed. The clinic's website featured before and after photos and glowing testimonials, but failed to mention that the primary dentist lacked proper licensing and had been operating without oversight for years. The facility's conversion from a residential house to a medical clinic had been done cheaply, with inadequate ventilation, sterilization equipment, and emergency medical supplies. Robert's pre-procedure consultation had been rushed, with no comprehensive medical history taken or proper risk assessment conducted. The warning signs were evident to anyone with medical knowledge: outdated equipment, questionable sterilization procedures, and a staff that seemed more focused on processing patients quickly than ensuring their safety. Robert's procedure was scheduled to begin immediately upon his arrival, with no waiting period or second opinion offered despite the complexity of the planned surgery. During the surgical procedure, the unlicensed dentist accidentally punctured Robert's sinus cavity with a drill, creating a direct pathway for bacteria to enter his bloodstream. The resulting infection spread rapidly through his system, causing sepsis and organ failure that the clinic was completely unprepared to treat. The facility lacked proper emergency equipment and medications needed to address life-threatening complications. Robert went into shock on the operating table as his blood pressure plummeted and his organs began shutting down. The panicked staff had no experience dealing with medical emergencies and no protocols for transferring patients to proper hospitals. He died from septic shock and multiple organ failure, while the clinic staff tried desperately to cover up their negligence. The clinic initially tried to claim Robert had died from a pre-existing heart condition unrelated to the surgery, but Mexican authorities investigated and found the facility was operating without proper licenses or medical oversight. Robert's family faced enormous challenges getting his body returned to the U.S. and seeking legal recourse in a foreign legal system. It was March 14, 2018. The morning sun was just rising over Dubai, and the city's glass towers reflected the golden light. Nearly 980 feet above the streets, a construction crane stood at the top of one of the tallest buildings under construction. The narrow steel beam at its outer edge wasn't built for anything other than maintenance, but that morning, it became the starting point for a dangerous record attempt. Lucas Trump, 28, from Brazil, had been involved in base jumping for years. He was known within the sport for pushing himself to higher and more technical jumps. His goal that day was to set a personal best by jumping from one of the tallest cranes in the world, located on an unfinished skyscraper in downtown Dubai. The jump wasn't authorized. Lucas and a friend entered the restricted construction site before dawn to avoid security patrols. They made their way up through the unfinished building, climbing internal ladders and navigating exposed framework until they reached the crane's top platform. The climb took nearly an hour. From there, the city stretched out in all directions, a mix of skyscrapers, desert, and ocean in the distance. His plan was simple in theory: leap from the crane's beam, free fall for about 3 seconds, then deploy his parachute at a safe altitude and land in an open area away from the building. His gear was designed for short delay jumps, and his friend was positioned to film from a secondary platform. But conditions at that height weren't the same as at ground level. Between the tall buildings, unpredictable wind gusts could develop quickly. In urban base jumping, these sudden crosswinds are one of the most dangerous factors, and there's almost no margin for error if something goes wrong. Lucas secured his gear, stepped carefully onto the crane's narrow outer beam, and prepared to jump. The metal vibrated faintly under his boots, and gusts of wind tugged at his clothes. He took one last look down at the landing zone and jumped. For the first second, everything looked controlled. He stabilized his body position as the skyline fell away beneath him. But only 2 seconds into the fall, a strong gust hit from his left side. The sudden push shifted his trajectory toward the crane's vertical support cables, a collision that could have been fatal. To avoid them, Lucas pulled his parachute early. The canopy opened, but part of it immediately snagged on the crane's structure. The snag collapsed one side of the parachute, sending him into a fast, uncontrolled spin. He had less than 600 feet left. That wasn't enough altitude to cut the tangled parachute away and deploy a reserve. Spinning and unable to regain control, Lucas struck a steel beam attached to the side of the building. The impact threw him off his descent path, and he tumbled the rest of the way down to the construction site below. Workers on lower floors heard the impact and saw his parachute canopy fall past the windows. Security reached him within moments and called for emergency medical services. Paramedics arrived quickly, but his injuries from multiple high-speed impacts were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead at the scene. An investigation later reviewed helmet footage and construction site security cameras. They confirmed that the jump started cleanly, but the crosswind forced an early parachute deployment. The partial entanglement left no time or altitude for recovery. The incident served as another reminder within the base jumping community. In urban environments, wind patterns can be unpredictable and deadly, and even experienced jumpers have no room for mistakes when working with so little altitude. It was August 3rd, 2019, in Miami, Florida. Laura Pennington, a 24-year-old personal trainer at Pinnacle Fitness Center, was arriving for what should have been an exciting Saturday morning. Known for her high-energy classes and dedication to client safety, Laura was thrilled about launching a new kickboxing class she had been developing for months. However, Laura had been working extra hours all week and running on only 4 hours of sleep. To combat insomnia, she had been taking prescription sleep aids that affected her reaction time and spatial awareness, leaving her feeling groggy and less coordinated than usual. That morning, she arrived early at 6:30 a.m. to set up equipment, carrying her gym bag, water bottle, and workout plans. The fitness center had recently installed new automatic sliding doors with powerful motors designed for heavy commercial traffic. The doors' safety sensors had been malfunctioning intermittently, sometimes failing to detect people in the doorway. Maintenance had been postponed due to the gym's busy schedule. The heavy glass panels closed with approximately 300 pounds of force to seal against Miami's humid climate. As Laura approached while reviewing her class notes, she wasn't paying attention to her surroundings. The sleep medication had dulled her alertness, and excitement about her new class had her focused on paperwork rather than potential danger. Security cameras captured the tragic sequence. The automatic door opened as Laura approached, sensors initially detecting her presence. However, as she stepped into the doorway, the malfunctioning system lost track of her position and triggered the doors to close unexpectedly. Laura was caught directly in the center, as both heavy glass panels compressed against her torso with tremendous force. The impact immediately fractured several ribs and compressed her chest cavity, making breathing extremely difficult. She dropped her materials and desperately tried pushing against the doors, but the system continued applying crushing pressure. The door's safety mechanism failed to reverse when encountering resistance, trapping her in its deadly grip. Her fractured ribs punctured her left lung, causing it to collapse and fill with blood. The chest compression made it impossible to draw a breath or call for help. Laura's screams were muffled as relentless pressure prevented chest expansion. Blood appeared at her mouth as internal bleeding progressed rapidly. The powerful motors continued their cycle, unaware of the human life being crushed between the panels. After 45 agonizing seconds, a backup safety system activated, causing the doors to reverse. But the damage was done. Laura collapsed in the doorway, her chest severely compromised and breathing labored. The gym's manager arrived at 6:45 a.m., finding Laura barely conscious. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, but found her in severe respiratory distress with obvious chest trauma. She was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital, where emergency surgery revealed massive internal trauma, including tension pneumothorax and internal hemorrhaging. At 8:20 a.m., Laura Pennington died from crushing chest injuries, just 2 hours after arriving to teach her anticipated class. The fitness center immediately replaced the door system and implemented safety reviews industry-wide. Laura's death highlighted the deadly potential of malfunctioning automated systems and the critical importance of regular safety maintenance in commercial facilities. Her tragic end served as a wake-up call for businesses everywhere about the hidden dangers of everyday technology. It was August 22, 2016, and the crisp mountain air of Interlaken, Switzerland carried the excited voices of tourists preparing for extreme sports adventures in one of Europe's premier adrenaline destinations. The town, nestled between two pristine alpine lakes and surrounded by snow-capped peaks, had built its reputation on offering heart-stopping activities like bungee jumping, paragliding, and skydiving. The 200-foot bridge spanning a rocky gorge had become famous among thrill-seekers, though its popularity had also attracted operators more interested in profits than safety. Michael Chen checked his harness nervously as he watched other jumpers leap from the platform, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and fear. At 35, the software engineer had joined his more adventurous friends on a European vacation that included several extreme sports activities he'd never attempted before. The tour company they'd chosen offered significantly cheaper prices than established operators, a decision that had seemed smart when booking but now felt ominous as Michael observed their questionable safety protocols. The bungee jumping equipment appeared old and poorly maintained, with frayed ropes and rusty hardware that would have failed inspection at reputable facilities. Several other tourists had expressed concerns about the safety protocols, but the tour guides dismissed their worries with assurances that accidents were impossible. Michael was nervous about the activities, but didn't want to appear cowardly in front of his friends. who seemed excited about the bargain prices they'd found. The tour operators had a questionable safety record that included several near misses and minor injuries, but they'd managed to avoid serious scrutiny by operating in a regulatory gray area. Their business model depended on cutting corners wherever possible, from using expired equipment to hiring unqualified staff who lacked proper training in safety procedures. Michael's weight calculation was done hastily by an operator who seemed more interested in processing customers quickly than ensuring their safety. As Michael prepared to jump, the tour operators failed to properly calculate his weight and selected a bungee cord that was too long for his 180-pound frame. The critical error would prove fatal, as the cord's length exceeded safe parameters for someone of Michael's body mass. His friends watched from the platform as Michael took his position at the edge, trusting completely in equipment that was about to fail catastrophically. Michael's jump began normally as he leaped from the 200-foot bridge with his arms spread wide, the initial freefall creating the exhilarating sensation that made bungee jumping so popular. But as the cord reached its extension point, it continued stretching far beyond its safe limit, carrying Michael toward the rocky riverbed below at dangerous speed. His friends watched in horror as the bungee cord stretched like a rubber band, failing to arrest Michael's fall at the proper distance above the ground. He struck the rocky riverbed with tremendous force, suffering massive internal injuries and spinal trauma that would prove unsurvivable. The tour operators immediately began destroying evidence and claiming the equipment had been sabotaged by competitors. Michael was airlifted to a trauma center, but died from his injuries during emergency surgery, his vacation ending in tragedy that could have been prevented with proper safety protocols. Swiss authorities launched an investigation that revealed the tour company's history of violations and corner cutting, leading to criminal charges and the facility's permanent closure. It was September 8, 2018 in Atlanta, Georgia. Brittany Lowe, a 31-year-old loan officer at First National Bank, was heading into work on what should have been a routine Saturday morning. Known for her professional demeanor and punctuality, Brittany always arrived at exactly 8:30 a.m., even on weekends. She had a severe bee allergy that required her to carry an EpiPen everywhere, though she had become complacent about checking its expiration date. That morning, Brittany was coming in for overtime work to process urgent loan applications before Monday's deadline. The building's weekend security staff was reduced to just one guard making rounds on the upper floors. She wore her typical business attire and had recently switched to a new floral-scented perfume that she loved, but didn't realize would prove deadly. The First National Bank building featured an ornate 1960s brass revolving door at its main entrance. The heavy panels had recently been serviced, but unknown to anyone, wasps had built a nest in the door's upper mechanism during the recent warm weather. The insects had been disturbed by the door's movement throughout the week, making them increasingly agitated. At 8:28 a.m., Brittany entered the revolving door while discussing a client's mortgage terms on her Bluetooth headset. Her new perfume's floral scent had attracted several wasps that began swarming around the confined space. Security footage shows her entering normally, completely unaware of the danger building around her. As she pushed the door panel forward, the agitated wasps began attacking. The revolving door's mechanism suddenly jammed due to debris from the disturbed nest, trapping Brittany in the small triangular compartment with no way to escape. Within seconds, she received multiple stings on her neck, face, and hands from at least 6 furious wasps. Her severe allergic reaction began immediately. Brittany's throat started swelling rapidly, and her breathing became increasingly labored. She dropped her phone and frantically searched through her purse for her EpiPen, but when she found it, she discovered to her horror that it had expired 3 months earlier. The confined space prevented her from escaping the continued wasp attacks as more insects emerged from their damaged nest. Her face and throat swelled dramatically as anaphylactic shock progressed with terrifying speed. The allergic reaction caused her larynx to close, cutting off her airway completely. She began making desperate choking sounds that were audible through the glass panels as she clawed at her swollen throat, unable to draw breath. Her skin turned blue from oxygen deprivation as the anaphylaxis reached its final stage. The wasps continued their relentless attack in the confined space, delivering more venom into her already overwhelmed system. After 4 agonizing minutes trapped in the revolving door, Brittany collapsed against the glass panel, unconscious from severe anaphylaxis and oxygen deprivation. The security guard discovered her at 8:45 a.m. during his routine lobby check, finding her unconscious and severely swollen beyond recognition. Emergency services used power tools to extract her from the jammed revolving door mechanism, while paramedics administered epinephrine and attempted to establish an airway. But the allergic reaction had progressed too far. She was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save her life, but the damage was irreversible. At 9:28 a.m., Brittany Lowe was pronounced dead from anaphylactic shock, caused by multiple wasp stings. The building immediately had the wasp nest professionally removed and replaced the revolving door with automatic sliding doors. A simple change in perfume and an expired EpiPen had cost Brittany her life in the most unexpected way possible. Her death highlighted the critical importance of maintaining emergency medications and being aware of hidden dangers in everyday environments. It was June 8, 2015, and the golden hour light painted the whitewashed buildings of Santorini in warm hues as tourists gathered along the clifftop paths to witness one of the world's most famous sunsets. The Greek island's dramatic landscape, carved by ancient volcanic activity, created a romantic backdrop that had made it a premier honeymoon destination. The Aegean Sea stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its deep blue waters contrasting sharply with the island's distinctive architecture, perched 1,000 feet above sea level. Sarah Mitchell smiled as she walked hand in hand with her new husband Mark along the scenic path near their luxury resort, though tension had been building between them throughout their week-long honeymoon. At 28, the marketing manager had worked hard to build a successful career and comfortable lifestyle, never suspecting that Mark had been hiding devastating financial problems that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. Their dream honeymoon was being funded by credit cards that Mark had maxed out without Sarah's knowledge. The arguments had started on their 3rd day when Sarah discovered suspicious charges on their shared credit cards, cash advances and gambling transactions that Mark couldn't explain. His evasive answers and defensive behavior had created a cloud of suspicion that grew darker with each passing day. Sarah's questions about their finances had triggered increasingly volatile responses from Mark, whose desperation was becoming harder to hide. Mark's gambling addiction had spiraled completely out of control over the past year, accumulating debts that now totaled over $200,000. He'd been secretly borrowing against their home, emptying Sarah's retirement accounts, and even taking loans from dangerous people who didn't accept excuses for late payments. The life insurance policy he'd convinced Sarah to sign just weeks before their wedding represented his only hope of escaping the financial disaster he'd created. As they walked along the clifftop path during what should have been a romantic sunset stroll, Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. Sarah had threatened to leave him when she discovered the extent of his deception, and Mark realized that his carefully constructed lies were finally collapsing. The isolated location, with its 400-foot drop to the rocks below, presented an opportunity that his desperate mind couldn't ignore. Mark suggested they venture to a more secluded viewpoint away from other tourists, claiming he wanted privacy for an important conversation about their future. Sarah reluctantly agreed, hoping they could finally address the financial problems that were destroying their marriage. When they reached the isolated area, Mark's demeanor suddenly changed from apologetic to threatening. He confessed his financial ruin and gambling debts, then grabbed Sarah when she threatened to leave him immediately. In a moment of desperation and rage, Mark pushed his new wife over the cliff edge, watching her fall 400 feet to her death on the rocks below. He immediately began screaming for help, claiming Sarah had slipped while taking photos of the sunset. Greek authorities initially treated Sarah's death as a tragic accident, with Mark playing the role of grieving widower convincingly. However, inconsistencies in his story and suspicious behavior during questioning raised red flags with experienced investigators. Financial records revealed Mark's massive debts and the recent life insurance policy. while security footage showed the couple arguing violently before their final walk. Mark was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to 25 years in a Greek prison. It was April 12, 2017, off the coast of Cozumel, Mexico. The Royal Caribbean ship Freedom of the Seas had anchored just offshore, the morning sun bright on calm water. Hundreds of passengers lined up to disembark for their day in port, unaware that the routine tendering process would end in irreversible tragedy. Sharon Hayes, 54, from San Antonio, was among them. A middle school teacher for nearly 3 decades, she was respected for her patience and practicality. She was not an adventurous traveler. Her life centered on family, students, and church. This cruise had been her husband's idea, a chance to celebrate their daughter's college graduation. Sharon had hesitated, worried about costs and crowds, but finally agreed. For her, this trip was meant to be a rare reward after years of steady work and sacrifice. She approached risk cautiously, rarely pushing boundaries. At school, she discouraged reckless behavior, and at home, she emphasized safety and order. Still, she placed trust in systems, assuming the cruise line, like any large institution, had measures in place to keep passengers secure. The tender system, which ferried passengers by smaller boats from anchored cruise ships to port, was foreign to her, but she accepted it as a standard practice. What she did not realize was that tendering consistently ranks among the riskiest operations on a cruise. Narrow aluminum gangways slick with spray, steep steps without handrails on one side, and constant vertical movement as the larger ship rose and fell against the much smaller boat. Even in calm seas, the two vessels rarely stayed aligned for more than a few seconds at a time. That morning, Sharon, her husband, and daughter waited on the embarkation deck in a long queue. Passengers jostled close together, many carrying bags or cameras. The gangway bridge connecting ship to tender dipped and lifted with each small swell, creating a brief window when a passenger could step safely. Crew members stood at either end, urging people forward the moment the platforms lined up. Sharon appeared tense, gripping the rail tightly. A woman behind her later recalled Sharon hesitating at the small but uneven step where metal ramp met the tender's open platform. Her family was only a few feet away when it happened. Sharon placed her foot forward, but the tender dropped half a foot lower just as she shifted her weight. Her sole skidded on the wet aluminum lip, and she lost balance. Her free hand reached for the crewman's arm but missed, and her body tipped sideways into the gap. She fell into the narrow strip of water between ship and tender. Crew shouted immediately, but the surge from the tender's engines was still active as it held position. The suction dragged her toward the stern before anyone could reach her. Witnesses saw her head surface briefly, her arms striking against the hull. Then, with the boat still maneuvering, its engines churned. Several passengers screamed as Sharon was pulled under, her body striking the propellers. The water foamed red almost instantly. Crew cut power within seconds, but the damage was done. Divers entered the water, recovering her body within minutes, but her injuries were described as catastrophic. Her husband and daughter were ushered away by staff, both in shock, while the remaining passengers waited in stunned silence. 3 days later, Sharon's body was flown home to Texas. Her funeral was small, attended by family, fellow teachers, and students. The school district offered counseling, and her church community provided support, but the loss was abrupt and disorienting. Mexican maritime authorities completed an investigation, concluding the incident was preventable. Recommendations included stationing additional crew at the tender entry, halting engine thrust while passengers boarded, and delaying transfer when the sea state caused excessive movement between vessels. It was February 4th, 2013, and the Vermilion Cliffs in northern Arizona stood out in the afternoon sun. The red rock walls and steep canyons stretched for miles, with sheer drops to the desert floor 1,200 feet below. Between two massive canyon walls, a slack line, a narrow strip of webbing, was set up across a gap almost 2,000 feet wide. Tom Jones, a 32-year-old experienced slackliner from Oregon, was preparing to walk the entire line without a safety harness. He had years of practice crossing lines over rivers, cliffs, and valleys, but this was by far his most dangerous attempt. Walking without a tether at that height meant that even one small mistake would be fatal. His small crew had spent several days securing the line. They used industrial-grade webbing, anchored into the rock on both sides with heavy-duty bolts and backup points that could hold much more than a person's weight. Cameras were placed along the route to record the attempt for a planned documentary about extreme balance sports. Weather reports predicted light winds, but canyon systems are unpredictable. A sudden gust can come without warning, and even a small shift in wind speed can cause major problems for a highliner. That afternoon, the air seemed calm, and the line barely moved in the breeze. Tom stepped onto the line, his arms extended for balance. He moved slowly, each step rolling from heel to toe, adjusting constantly to keep his weight centered over the narrow strip of webbing. The drop below was massive, over 1,000 feet of open air, ending in jagged rock. His crew watched from each end of the line as he made steady progress. About halfway across, Tom paused to adjust his stance. The line swayed slightly under his weight, and he waited for it to settle. The canyon was silent except for the faint creak of the tensioned webbing. For several minutes, it looked like he was in full control. Then, without warning, a strong crosswind swept through the gap. The line began to shake more aggressively, forcing Tom into a crouched position to lower his center of gravity. He held this position for nearly 30 seconds, trying to ride out the movement. But a second gust hit harder than the first. The webbing moved sharply from side to side, and Tom's careful balance started to break down. He tried bouncing lightly on the line to counter the swaying, something experienced slackliners sometimes do to stabilize, but the movement of the wind and the accumulated strain in his legs made it harder to react quickly. As he shifted his weight to recover, his left foot slipped off the webbing. He lunged forward, trying to grab the line with his hands, but his momentum carried him sideways into open air. Without a harness, there was nothing to stop him. The fall was over 1,200 feet straight down. His crew could only watch in shock as he disappeared toward the canyon floor. They immediately called for emergency services. Because of the remote location, a helicopter team was dispatched. It took nearly an hour to reach the bottom of the canyon. When rescuers arrived, they confirmed that Tom had died instantly from the impact. In the days that followed, the slacklining community discussed the risks of free solo highlining, walking without any safety tether. While the sport allows for spectacular feats of balance, there is no margin for error at extreme heights. Even the most experienced athletes can be caught off guard by unpredictable weather. Tom's death became a sobering reminder that in highlining, skill and preparation cannot eliminate all the risks. One gust of wind, one small misstep, and there is no second chance. It was March 15, 2014, and the morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Pai, Thailand, as backpackers emerged from hostels to begin another day of exploration in the Bohemian mountain town. The small settlement, nestled in a valley 430 miles north of Bangkok, had become a magnet for young travelers seeking authentic experiences away from Thailand's crowded tourist beaches. The air carried the scent of incense and street food, while the sound of motorcycle engines echoed through narrow streets lined with bamboo guest houses and organic cafes. Jessica Williams adjusted her backpack straps as she studied the hand-drawn map a local had given her, marking remote waterfalls and hiking trails that promised the kind of hidden gems she'd been documenting on social media. At 23, the recent college graduate had been traveling solo through Southeast Asia for 2 months, sharing her adventures with friends and family back home through daily posts and photos. Her Instagram account had become a virtual travel diary, filled with stunning landscapes and cultural encounters that made her followers envious of her courage to explore the world alone. The small mountain town of Pai represented everything Jessica loved about backpacker travel: authentic local culture, stunning natural beauty, and the kind of off-the-beaten-path experiences that couldn't be found in guidebooks. She'd planned to stay 3 days before continuing to Chiang Mai, but the town's laid-back atmosphere and friendly locals had made her consider extending her visit. The hostel staff had noticed her enthusiasm for adventure, particularly her interest in remote hiking trails and waterfall locations that most tourists never discovered. Jessica's excitement about exploring beyond the typical tourist sites had led her to befriend Somchai, a local motorcycle taxi driver who claimed to know secret spots that foreign visitors never saw. He'd approached her outside a cafe, offering to take her to a secluded waterfall where she could swim in crystal-clear pools surrounded by untouched jungle. His English was limited, but his smile seemed genuine, and Jessica's adventurous spirit made his offer irresistible. The warning signs were subtle but present. Other backpackers had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around certain local men who seemed too eager to help female travelers. Jessica's hostel had informal warnings about going alone with motorcycle taxi drivers to remote locations, but the advice seemed overly cautious to someone who'd been traveling safely for months. Her last social media post showed her excitement about exploring hidden gems with her new local friend, complete with photos of Somchai and his motorcycle. Somchai picked up Jessica early in the morning, when few other tourists were awake to witness their departure. He drove her 12 miles outside town on winding mountain roads that grew increasingly remote with each passing mile. Jessica enjoyed the scenic ride through rice paddies and jungle, taking photos of the landscape while trusting completely in her guide's knowledge of the area. When they reached what appeared to be a trailhead leading into dense jungle, Somchai explained they would need to hike 20 minutes to reach the waterfall. Jessica followed him eagerly down a narrow path that showed no signs of regular use, her excitement building as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. The isolation that had seemed romantic and adventurous began to feel ominous as the jungle closed around them. The attack came without warning when they reached a small clearing miles from any help. Somchai's friendly demeanor disappeared as he grabbed Jessica and attempted to sexually assault her, his intentions finally revealed in the remote location he'd carefully chosen. Jessica fought back desperately, screaming for help that would never come in the isolated jungle setting. During the violent struggle, Somchai struck Jessica with a rock, causing fatal head trauma that ended her young life in a moment of brutal violence. Panicking at what he'd done, he buried her body in a shallow grave in the dense jungle, then returned to town, acting as if nothing had happened. He continued operating his taxi service, even helping other tourists while Jessica's body decomposed in the wilderness. Jessica's family became concerned when she failed to check in for over a week, which was completely out of character for someone who posted daily updates. Thai police initially showed little interest in the case, treating it as another backpacker who had simply moved on without informing anyone. International pressure and media attention eventually forced a proper investigation, leading to Somchai's arrest and Jessica's remains being found 6 months later. It was April 2, 2012, at Victoria Falls, which sits on the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe. By midday, the sun was bright and hot. Mist from the waterfall drifted across the gorge, creating faint rainbows. The roar of the water was constant, and the air was damp enough to coat the cliffs. Below, the Zambezi River surged through a narrow channel, its current so strong they could drag even the best swimmers. Daniel Royce, 33, stood near the edge of the gorge, checking his gear. He was an experienced slackliner with over 10 years of practice walking narrow webbing over dangerous terrain, spanning city skylines, mountain valleys, and deep canyons. This attempt was his most ambitious yet, a 1,200-foot walk over the Zambezi River, directly above the turbulent waters of the fall's lower gorge. A team of local climbers and rigging specialists had set up the line the day before. They anchored the industrial-grade webbing into rock faces on both sides and tensioned it for stability, though some natural sway was inevitable. The line was about 2 inches wide, enough for a foot, but nothing more. Event rules required Daniel to wear a safety harness attached to a leash that ran along the line. It wouldn't prevent a fall, but it could stop him from hitting the river directly. Even so, falling meant he could slam into the cliff wall or hang in a dangerous position in the mist and wind. Daniel had spent months preparing for this day, training for balance and learning to adjust for moisture on the webbing. But Victoria Falls was unpredictable. Gusts of wind could sweep through the gorge without warning, and mist could make the rope slick in seconds. By the time the small crowd gathered on both sides of the gorge, conditions looked favorable. Winds were light, and the sun was high. Daniel finished his stretches, inspected the rig one last time, and stepped onto the line. His first steps were steady. He kept his knees slightly bent, arms out for balance, placing each foot carefully in the center of the webbing. The line dipped slightly under his weight, but responded well to his control. Below, the Zambezi churned and foamed, but Daniel focused only on the webbing ahead. About halfway across, he stopped briefly to reset his stance. A light breeze moved through the gorge, swaying the line just enough to require small adjustments. He handled it easily and started forward again. Then, without warning, a stronger gust swept through. Mist from the falls clung to the line, making it slippery. Daniel's right foot slipped slightly. He threw his arms wide and made a quick recovery, but the sudden movement caused the webbing to oscillate more than usual. Before the line settled, another gust, stronger than the first, hit from the opposite direction. The wet webbing and unstable sway broke his balance. Daniel fell sideways. His harness leash caught after a short drop, but momentum swung him hard into the rock wall. The impact left him semi-conscious. His body slid along the cliff until the leash pulled tight. Hanging above the rapids, Daniel tried to grab the safety line, but his grip failed. He slipped free and dropped into the river. The Zambezi's current took him immediately. Rescue boats launched from downstream, but the combination of jagged rocks and powerful water made the search difficult. Nearly 2 hours later, crews found his body several miles downriver. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma from the cliff impact, followed by drowning. Slacklining organizations later stressed that even experienced professionals face extreme risk in such environments. A single slip, combined with weather and terrain, can turn a record attempt into a fatal accident. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.